Hey, good morning. Time now 8 a.m. exactly on the Tuesday, November the 7th, 2023 in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize a series of online morning seminars to introduce the latest World Bank publications presented by the authors of those reports. Every spring and the fall, respective regional chief economist offices publish the regional economic update, and then we try to cover all of them to introduce in our morning seminar programs. This morning, we are focusing on Middle East and North Africa regions. We have two economists presenting the latest update of the MENA regions to the audience in Japan. We have Jessica Torres Coronado, who is an economist in the Middle East and North Africa Regional Chief Economist Office. And also we have Nelly El Malak, who is also the economist in the same Chief Economist Office for the Middle East and North Africa. The title of the report is the Balancing Act, Jobs and Wages in the Middle East and North Africa When Crisis Hit. We will listen to them presenting the key and main point of the report for next 35-40 minutes. After their presentation, I'll read the question that we received from you in advance. And also, your questions during the seminar will be welcome. Please send your question by using the online form posted on the announcement page of this seminar, or you can simply post your question on the YouTube chat section. So I will read your question on your behalf, asking our speakers to respond. With that, I would like to formally invite Jessica and Nelly to come in to kick off the presentation. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Koichi. We're happy to have the opportunity to present the latest findings of the MENA economic update. The title of the report is Balancing Act, Jobs and Wages in the Middle East and North Africa When Crisis Hit. The team is grateful to Roberta Gatti and Daniel Lederman for their guidance. The team also includes Jessica Torres, Joanna Silva, Rana Lotfi, Ilya Suvanov, and myself, Nelly Maner. And before I start this presentation, I would like to also thank all the team members for the wonderful work behind this report. So first, let us start by presenting the key messages of this report. Economic activity in MENA is forecast to experience a sharp reduction in 2020. Successive oil production cuts combined with relatively low oil price level brought an end to the tale of two MENAs and diverging growth patterns that we observed between exporters and oil importers in the region. In MENA, at the time of the publication of this report, which went live on October the 5th, GDP growth rate was forecast to be at 6% in 2022 and to decline to 1.9% this year. And we also highlight that GCC countries are those that experience the sharpest deceleration in growth, where growth was forecast to decline from 7.3% in 2022 to 1% in 2023. This report tries to look at labor market adjustments following various shocks, and particularly we are looking at how the global shocks that hit the world, but also the MENA region during the period between 2020 and 2022 affected labor markets. We estimate that these shocks resulted in an increase of over 5 million individuals becoming unemployed in the MENA region, which adds to the high levels of unemployment that characterize the region even before COVID-19 hit. We also highlight that the region would have witnessed a much smaller number of unemployed individuals due to these shocks had the MENA region had the same unemployment response of other emerging markets and developing economies. In fact, we estimate that the MENA region would have witnessed 2.1 million fewer unemployed individuals. We also highlight that there is a potential trade-off that economies must face during periods of economic downturns that reduce labor demand, and that's what we call in the report the balancing act. We highlight that during negative shocks that reduce labor demand, the trade-off that pertains is basically a trade-off between higher unemployment or lower real wages during contexts of high inflation. Importantly, we also mentioned that neither one of these two outcomes is desirable, and that's because job displacement can be associated with labor scarring, which is the term that's referred to in the literature to highlight long-term consequences that are associated with job losses, including, for example, earning losses, but also a higher likelihood of being informally employed or of being unemployed in the long term. We highlight, on the other hand, that the erosion of real incomes can have dire implications in terms of existing inequalities and poverty. Finally, the policy implications that we highlight in this report are very clear. We highlight that public policies should protect the most vulnerable individuals with well-targeted cash transfers while allowing real wages to adjust. Next, Jessica is going to the conceptual framework for this report before we move on to a series of event studies as well as of our terms of scoring and standards of living, and we will conclude with some policy options. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Nelly. Before I start with the macroeconomic outlook, I just want to point out that the forecasts that we are going to present are coming from the World Bank's macro poverty outlook as of the date of publication of our report, which is October 5th of 2023. These forecasts project that economic activity in MENA will sharply decelerate in 2023. In the left panel, we are showing an index of cumulative growth in real GDP in MENA between 2021 and 2024, and we are comparing it to the performance of economic activity in the rest of the world. And in the right panel, we are showing the different country groups in MENA, the Gulf Cooperation Council, developing oil importers, excluding Egypt. Egypt is shown in that black line, and then we have developing oil exporters in the blue line. The surge in oil prices that we saw last year brought extraordinary growth to MENA. In the left panel, we can see that MENA grew an average of 6%, which is about 3 percentage points faster than the world economy. This fast pace of growth was driven by the oil exporters, especially the GCC economies, as we see in that red line in the right panel. Notice here also the strong divergence in growth rates between the oil exporters in MENA and the oil importers. And this is what the previous regional update referred to as the tale of two MENAs. Growth in the GCC in 2022 in particular exceeded 7%. In 2023, growth in the region is projected to be more moderate, with the GCC and developing oil exporters again driving this deceleration. Average growth in the region is projected to average 1.9%. In the GCC, the average is projected at 1%, which is significantly less than the levels observed in 2022. Among developing oil exporters, growth is projected at 2.4%, again, significantly less than the 4.3% observed in 2022. And among oil importers, growth is projected to average 3.6%, again, down from the average of 4.9% observed in 2022. Next slide, please. Base effects were forecast to pull growth down in 2023, and the slowdown in the global economic activity was also projected to affect growth in the region. But the largest downgrades to the 2023 forecast have occurred following the oil production cuts of the past months. In this figure, we are showing revisions to the monthly forecast for growth in 2023 as reported by private sector analysts. And we are showing revisions relative to the forecasts made in February of 2022 before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We are marking in gray the months of the OPEC Plus announcements in October of 2022, April of 2023, and then again, the voluntary cut announced by Saudi Arabia in June of 2023, which was extended through the end of the year. And what we want to show or highlight in this figure is the sharp downgrade that we observe in April of 2023 in the GCC, which is the blue line, and the other structural break in this time series in June, with the average for MENA, which is shown in that red line, following suit. Among developing oil importers, they are continuing to grapple with the domestic effects of the global shocks of the period between 2020 and 2022. Rising inflation among advanced economies and some emerging and developing economies led to a tightening of financial conditions across the world, which in the region contributed to currency depreciation in those economies that were indebted, and that in turn contributed to higher rates of domestic inflation. In this figure, we are showing inflation rates in MENA after adjusting for exchange rate fluctuations among economies that are not pegged to the US dollar. The red bar is showing the average year-on-year inflation from October of 2021 to February of 2022 before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The blue bar is showing average inflation in the post-war period from March of 2022 through August of 2023. And we can see here the spikes in inflation, especially in Morocco, in Tunisia, and in Egypt. The green bar, what is showing is the exchange rate adjusted for currency depreciations. This is the inflation rate after we account for changes in the exchange rate. And what we see in many countries, this adjusted inflation is much lower. The green bar is much lower than the blue bar, which is suggesting that if the exchange rate had remained at the levels observed in February of 2022, inflation would have been much lower. In Egypt, this counterfactual, actually, the green bar is negative. And that is because in this exercise, what is left after we remove the effect of the depreciation of the currency are the price controls and other subsidies, which are assumed to have occurred anyways in this period. Next, please. The global shocks from 2020 through 2022 have brought the highest levels of volatility in MENA terms of trade since 1980. Terms of trade is the ratio of the price of exports to the price of import. And what happened was that as the world was trying to recover from the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine affected terms of trade in MENA through the shocks to the price of oil and the price of agricultural commodity. In this figure, we are showing an index of volatility in terms of trade, and we are comparing MENA to other emerging market and developing economies, and we are also showing average for each MENA country group. What we see in this figure is that in general, volatility in terms of trade in MENA is higher compared to other developing economies. And this is driven by the oil exporters in the region, especially the GCC, which is that red line at the top. we can also see that the volatility in MENA in the last 5 years is high, even when compared to previous shocks, in particular to the mid-1980s and to what happened during the global financial crisis of 08 and 09. Next, please. And so in the fog of this macroeconomic turmoil, shocks to terms of trade, currency depreciation, inflation, we cannot lose sight of how these macroeconomic shocks are ultimately affecting the people of MENA. And this is what we are trying to do in the thematic chapters of this report. We look at the human side of macroeconomic turmoil through what happens in the labor market. When there are negative economic shocks that lower labor demand, there is a trade-off that economies face between more unemployment and lower real wages. And this is what we are calling the balancing act. When there's a shock, either unemployment will go up or real wages will go down. But there is extensive literature that shows that wages during negative shocks tend to be rigid or sticky. And if that is the case, then the adjustment through unemployment will be larger. However, when shocks occur in a context of high inflation, real wages will tend to fall, even if nominal wages remain constant, and that will help buffer the shock to unemployment. This is what we want to understand in the report. What happens in MENA? What happens in MENA's labor markets during negative shocks? How does this trade-off between unemployment, more unemployment, and lower real wages play out in the region? And we are doing this through two different sets of exercises. We first look at the last 30 years of labor market indicators, and we are comparing labor markets in MENA to other emerging market and developing economies during macroeconomic shocks. What we find is that during the period between 2020 and 2022, unemployment, there were an additional 5 million unemployed workers in the region with potential long-term consequences in their careers. In this figure, we are showing estimates of the responsiveness of unemployment to shocks in real GDP in MENA and other developing economies. And this is a response per shock of 1% in real GDP. And so what we see is that during expansions, when things are going well, unemployment falls. And that is what we are showing in those blue bars over there. And notice how the adjustment in unemployment is similar between MENA and other emerging markets. But during contractions, when things are going down, when real GDP falls, the response of unemployment in MENA is almost twice the response in other emerging markets. And that is the same negative shock to GDP, it results in more unemployment in MENA. In other dimensions, we look at other labor market adjustments, such as rates of labor force participation, rates of self-employment or informality, rates of public sector employment. The responses are similar in MENA and emerging markets. And so this means then that if MENA exhibited the same responsiveness of unemployment during downturns, there would be fewer people unemployed in MENA. When we apply this to the shocks observed between 2020 and 2022, we find that there would have been, instead of 5 million, there would have been only 3 million unemployed workers. Now Nelly is going to take over again to show our findings when we look at different episodes in the economic history of MENA. Over to you, Nelly.
Jessica. In addition to the exercise that we just presented, we also provide a deep dive into specific labor markets in the main developing economies. We look at very specific shocks. We look at 3 shocks. The first one is the COVID-19 shock. We also look at shocks to terms of trade. We look at negative terms of trade shocks. And we also look at large currency devaluation. We start by showing that following the COVID-19 shock, unemployment increased while nominal earnings remained rigid in emerging market and developing economies. In this slide, we report results using fixed effect regressions of labor market outcomes in a global sample of emerging market and developing economies. We use data from national estimates provided by the International Labour Organization, and we look at 2 margins of adjustment. The first one is unemployment, presented in the chart on the left-hand side, and the second one is nominal monthly earnings, which is presented in the chart on the right-hand side. We report coefficient estimates for each year after the pandemic from 2020 to 2022 relative to the baseline year, which is the year 2019. As you can see, we find an increase in unemployment in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 shock that's estimated to be approximately 1 percentage point increase in 2020. And we find, on the other hand, that nominal monthly earnings remained rigid, which is in line with the evidence that Jessica presented earlier from the existing literature, which highlights downward nominal wage rigidity. We also find evidence that unemployment took center stage as the primary margin of adjustment in MENA countries after the COVID-19 shock. In this slide, we are reporting the percentage point change in total unemployment for the quarters between 2020 Q2 to 2021 Q4. And for this exercise, we rely on a sample of 6 MENA countries for which quarterly data is readily available in order to conduct this type of exercise. Our sample includes countries such as Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Tunisia. And in order to estimate the impact of the pandemic on unemployment, we use data that's usually available from the first quarter of 2012 up until the last quarter of 2019 in order to predict what would have been unemployment in the absence of the COVID-19 shock. And in order to come up with the estimate of the impact of the pandemic on unemployment rates, we subtract the predicted unemployment rate from this exercise from the observed unemployment rate. And we find a sizable increase in unemployment in the aftermath of the COVID-19 shock, which is estimated to be approximately an increase by 2.4 percentage points in 2020 Q2. And as you can see, unemployment remained relatively high throughout 2020, but also in 2021 and started to only go down towards the end of 2021 with an estimated increase by 1.2 percentage points in 2021 Q4. And it's also important that we generally estimate higher increases in unemployment rates in developing MENA countries compared to GCC countries such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia. It's also important to highlight that we find an exception to this rule. So Iran is actually one exception to the rule. We find that whereas in MENA countries we find that unemployment was the primary margin of adjustment after the COVID-19 shock, we find that in Iran the labor market adjusted primarily through a decline in real wages following COVID-19. In this slide, we are comparing margins of adjustment in the labor market in Iran following the pandemic, which is presented by the red line, and following a negative terms of trade shock, which is presented by the blue line, and it's the global decline in oil prices in the years 2014-2015. We look at 2 margins of adjustment, unemployment, which is presented in the chart on the left-hand side, and real monthly earnings, which is presented on the chart in the right-hand side. And we index each one of these two indicators to 1 at the beginning of the event. And on the x-axis, what you see here is the number of quarters that precede and follow the given shock. So we have 6 quarters before and 6 quarters after the beginning of the pandemic, and before and after the global decline in oil prices. So as we just highlighted, we document that after the pandemic, unemployment rates went down in Iran, and the labor market primarily adjusted through a reduction in real monthly earnings, as you see in the chart on the right-hand side. On the other hand, following the global decline in oil prices, which occurred in the years 2014 and 2015, we find that unemployment was actually rising, and probably that was because the rising real monthly earning during the same time period. And here it's important to document that these differences in the labor market adjustment could be due to higher inflation in the context of the pandemic in Iran. In Iran, inflation stood in the year 2020 at 30%, whereas inflation in 2015 was only 12.5%, which is still high, but for the context of Iran, this is a relatively low rate of inflation. And therefore, inflation might be the reason why we observe this decline in real wages in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 shock in Iran. Also document in the report that when shocks are inflationary, labor markets in emerging markets and developing economies tend to adjust through lower real wages. And that's precisely the case following large currency devaluations. In this slide, we are reporting the results from difference in differences methodology, and we look at the impact of large devaluations in emerging market and developing economies. We look at real monthly earnings, and we document the coefficient estimates before these large currency devaluation shocks, which are presented by the red square, and after the currency devaluation shock, which is presented by the blue circle. And we report the average treatment effect on the treated on the y-axis. And again, here we're using data from the national estimates that are provided by the International Labour Organization, and this is yearly data. So on the x-axis, we are reporting the number of years before and after the currency devaluation shock. The threshold that we use in this exercise is a 30% threshold, which corresponds to the smallest of the 3 largest currency devaluations that Egypt experienced between 2020 and 2021. As you can see in this slide, prior to the currency devaluation shock, real monthly earnings remain unaffected, whereas after the currency devaluation shock, we can see that there is a very large decline in real monthly earnings in emerging market and developing economies, which suggests that labor markets adjust through prices following large currency devaluation. In the report, we also look at various margins of adjustment, which include, for example, unemployment, employment, and hours of work, and we document that these remain largely unaffected, whereas the real wages is the main margin through which labor markets adjust after large currency devaluations. We also highlight similar evidence from Egypt following the 2016 major currency devaluation. We highlight that inflation can buffer, in this case, the unemployment adjustment, but it comes at a different cost. We find that it leads to the erosion of real wages. In this chart, we report real wages and unemployment after the 2016 currency devaluation in Egypt, following which inflation stood at 30% in 2017. We document that workers in Egypt lost up to a fifth of their real incomes 15 months after the devaluation, and that this decline in real incomes was actually gradual. So 3 months after the devaluation, we estimate a 5% decline in real incomes. At 6 months after the devaluation, we document an 8% decline in real incomes. And then 15 months after the devaluation, we document a 21% decline in real incomes. However, due to the competitiveness effect of these large currency devaluations, we also document that unemployment went down in Egypt from 11% in 2016 Q4 to 9% in 2017 Q1, and that's approximately a 20% decline in unemployment. We discussed the implications of these findings in terms of labor scarring, which is, as we highlighted earlier, defined as the long-term negative consequences that are associated with job losses. We highlight in the report that unemployment carries long-term negative consequences. We use data from the Egypt Labor Market Panel survey in the year 2018, which allows us to track individual job trajectories from the first job up to the job that the individual is holding at the time of the interview. And for each one of the jobs that the individual could report, they are also asked about the reason for their job separation. And among these reasons, there could be, for example, firm shutdown. There could be also a suspension of the project or a job termination by the employer. So these reasons are categorized as reasons of involuntary job displacement, and we estimate what is the impact of this involuntary job displacement on workers in the long term, and we look at both women and men separately. We find evidence that these temporary involuntary job displacements could have long-term consequences that could even be felt even 10 years after these job losses occur. We document, for example, that displaced men are 9 percentage points more likely to be informally employed, and that displaced women experience approximately a 20% wage penalty even 10 years after these job separations. As we highlighted, there is a potential trade-off that economies must face during periods of economic downturns that reduce labor demand. And this trade-off is between more unemployment and lower real wages. Neither outcome is desirable, and that's because they have different implications. So when job losses occur, this could be associated with persistent scarring on employment trajectories. And that's referred to in the literature as labor scarring, and it refers to long-term penalties in terms of earnings. So displaced workers could face wage penalties several years after these job losses, and they can persist for a long period of time compared to individuals that were never subject to these job losses. On the other hand, lower real wages have different implications because they can also deepen existing income inequalities, and we know that the poor typically bear a disproportionately heavier burden associated with these shocks. In terms of policy implications, in the report we discuss various policy options. However, we document that the policy toolkit, even though it offers different instruments, not all of them have the same proven record of effectiveness. As we presented earlier, labor markets can adjust through various margins of adjustment through quantities, which means that the labor market can adjust through higher unemployment, through higher informality rates, or through changes in the hours of work, for example. And in this case, if the labor market adjusts through quantities, this could mean that there could be higher rates of unemployment, higher job losses, or higher informality. On the other hand, if the labor market adjusts through prices, this means that real wages tend to be eroded. There are various policies that could be implemented in order to remedy these labor market effects due to these various shocks. And we document, for example, a few, including active labor market policies, which is a group of policies that aim at increasing the employability of workers in the long term. As we highlight in the report, both the academic literature as well as World Bank reports document that active labor market policies have a mixed track record. Just to name a few, there are various dimensions that could affect the effectiveness of active labor market policies, and these include, for example, the type of the program, the duration of the program, the institutional design, which all matter in determining whether these active labor market policies are effective in order to remedy the labor market effects of various shocks. We also highlight that formalization interventions, which have been studied in a number of recent meta-analysis published in academic journals, have also a mixed track record. For example, a recent study that was published in Labor Economics, which provides a meta-analysis of various formalization interventions, highlights that the evidence that these policies actually work in inducing higher rates of formalization is very thin and requires further piloting. On the other hand, large cash transfer programs have been shown to generate positive effects on treated households, including, for example, on consumption, assets, on welfare, as well as individuals' well-being. We document also newer papers that show that social safety nets and large cash transfer programs not only generate beneficial effects for treated households, but they can also have positive large spillover effects on non-treated households. And finally, we highlight that it's very important to maintain the flexibility of real wages during periods of economic downturns, and not to index wages, for example, to the exchange rate or to inflation. And that's because by indexing wages to inflation, this will shut down the price adjustment channel and allow labor markets to only adjust through quantities, which could result into higher long-term unemployment and higher long-term informality. To conclude, the policy implications of this report are clear. We highlight in the report that it's very important to maintain the flexibility of real wages during periods of economic downturns. And this has to go hand in hand with well-targeted cash transfer programs to support the most vulnerable. And that's precisely because it's important to lower employment losses, as they have long-term negative consequences that can be either in the form of earning losses or in the form of higher long-term informality and higher unemployment. We also highlight that it's very important to protect the most vulnerable individuals with well-targeted cash transfers. And it's very important to be wary of indexing wages to inflation, because such policies could indeed lead to the worsening of enduring structural challenges in the MENA region. So what should be done now? We highlight in the report that it's important to start reforming social protection systems in the MENA region, and to try to divert the resources from the inefficient consumption subsidies to more efficient measures such as targeted cash transfer programs. Thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to questions and to your feedback.
Great. Thank you very much for your presentation, Jessica and Nelly, sharing the main point of the latest edition of the Middle East and North Africa Economic Update issued about a month ago. We received some questions from our viewers. Let me read those questions, asking you to respond. Two questions from Sasaki-san. Thank you for sending questions as always. First one, what are the priority countries in the region and the key policies needs to be introduced and implemented in order to enhance poverty reduction in the region and achieve the SDG goals 1? So any comment, responses, please. Thank you.
So thank you, Koichi, for the question. I'm going to respond and then leave the floor to my colleague Jessica to add some more. So what we highlight in the report is that it's very important to reform social protection systems in the MENA region. And we particularly highlight that it's very important to make sure that the resources are diverted away from inefficient measures such as the consumption subsidies and redirected toward the most efficient ways of supporting the most vulnerable segments of the population, and that's precisely large cash transfer programs. We document that cash transfer programs have a good track record, proven record of effectiveness in dealing with various issues, including, for example, raising consumption, improving individuals' welfare, and so on. So we highlight in the report that it's very important to protect the most vulnerable segments of the population through well-targeted cash transfer program, coupled with the real wage flexibility, which is also very important to maintain during adverse economic shocks. Over to you, Jessica, if you'd like to add anything.
Thank you, Nelly. I think you touched on what I was going to add as you were closing your remarks. What in this report we are looking at macroeconomic shocks. So what happens during downturns and which policies are the most effective to navigate shocks. The other policies in the policy toolkit, Nelly touched on them. Formalization, for example, those perhaps would be more appropriate in other times, in other circumstances. But what we are advocating is for price flexibility coupled with well-targeted cash transfers in periods of turmoil. That's I think all that I would add. Thank you, Nelly.
Thank you very much, Nelly and Jessica, for your responses. A second question from the Sasaki-san again. Let me read. Please elaborate on the informal sector in the region. How can we help them, and what kind of policies should the government in the region should introduce? Please.
I can. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jessica.
You sure, Nelly? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you, Koichi. That's a very good question. What we find in the report is that actually during macroeconomic shocks, the rates of informality, what happens in the informal sector, is very similar between MENA and other emerging markets and developing economies. Rates of informality tend to increase during negative shocks, during downturns, and rates of informality tend to decrease during economic expansions. And this responsiveness in this one dimension, MENA looks very similar to other emerging markets and developing economies. And so we invite you to look at the report. You can check our sources of data and you can see our findings in more detail. In terms of informality in the long run, and much more longer term patterns, we are right now working on a report looking at that, and Nelly and I are working together. And so Koichi, perhaps we can come back when we have our findings ready to be shared with you and the team. Thank you. I don't know, Nelly, if you want to add anything.
Thank you, Jessica. I'll just add, I think we touched upon the most relevant points to address the question that Koichi asked us. I'll just add that in the report, we also look at informality following the COVID-19 shock. And we do find evidence that the informal sector in certain countries was in fact more affected after the COVID-19 shock. We find evidence of increases in informality in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 shock. So informal outflows actually increased. So informal workers were more likely to lose their jobs after the COVID-19 shock. But then as the labor market started to recover from the pandemic, informal inflows started to increase again. So this highlights that the informal sector can also act as a buffer during periods of downturns. So it can also have individuals exiting from informalities, but also joining back informality sector after specific shocks.
Thank you for your responses. Let me continue reading the other questions. Next one, do digital technologies help increase the jobs, particularly for younger generations who come into the labor market in the region?
Thank you, Koichi, for this question. So this question is a very important one. However, in the report, we do not look at digital technologies. So I would like to invite our audience to have a look at another flagship that we produced in our office that's entitled The Upside of Digital Technology, which actually tries to look at some of the questions that you asked us regarding the adoption of digital technology. And one takeaway of this report is that digital technology has various socioeconomic benefits, including, for example, increases in female labor force participation rates. It can be associated with declines in unemployment and also higher job creation in certain sectors. So whereas this is something that we do not look at in this report, I would invite the audience to look at our flagship, which might have some answers that would be relevant for the audience.
Okay, thank you very much for your responses. We'll definitely try and follow up to, look into the possibility of organizing another round of the seminar featuring that report. Thank you. Okay, one more question in advance that we received, this one. Please comment on challenges on data collection and programs and activities being undertaken to support and improve the situation in the region in terms of the data collection. Any comment, please?
Thank you, Koichi. So we have had a tradition with each round of the MENA economic update to try and document data challenges. And we also try to administer beforehand, before the publication of each one of these reports, a large effort in order to try to collect as many data as possible to tackle the various questions that we try to address in these reports. So one of the challenges, of course, that we face, in particular when we try to study labor market dynamics and we try to study the evolution of labor markets over time, is the issue of data availability and data access. So this is something that we also try to document in the process of producing the report. And one of the main challenges is actually the access to microdata, which allows us to either perform a type of exercise like the one that Jessica presented in the presentation, or even the cross-country, or even the event study analysis that we also presented in today's presentation. So this is definitely an important agenda, one that's very important in order to advance research on any issue, and in particular in relation to labor market dynamics. So for example, one issue is in fact the access to high frequency microdata, and by high frequency we mean data that would be available quarter on quarter, which would be important in order to track momentous changes in the aftermath of the various shocks that we study in the report, which would be a superior data in order to examine how labor markets are faring after various shocks, and would allow us to look at changes in real time. Jessica, you might want to come in.
Okay, great. Thank you. You responded to all the questions that we received in advance in an effective manner. So before wrapping up this seminar, I would like to invite, in order of Nelly and Jessica, to share with us and our audience a final words and messages, and then we wrap up the seminar. So Nelly, please.
Thank you, Koichi. Perhaps what I would like to do is we remind again our audience of the key messages of the report. So importantly, one of the main messages of the report is the forecast of growth, which is to sharply decelerate in 2023. And once again, we would like to highlight that these forecasts were at the time of the publication on October the 5th. We would also like to highlight that unemployment was the primary margin of adjustment in MENA labor markets when shocks occur without triggering inflation, and we observe this type of adjustment after the COVID-19 shock, but we also find that this is the way labor market adjusted after negative terms of trade shocks. And we also document another margin of adjustment, which is a reduction in real incomes following shocks that trigger inflation, like, for example, large currency devaluations. We document that neither one of these outcomes is desirable, and that's because they have different implications. For example, job losses can be associated with long-term negative consequences on the workers, for example, as defined as earning losses in the long term or higher likelihood of being informally employed or unemployed in the long term. In terms of policy recommendations, they are quite clear. We highlight that it's very important to preserve real wage flexibility combined with well-targeted cash transfers in order to support the most vulnerable individuals. Over to you, Jessica.
Thanks. Oh, no, I just, on behalf of the team, Koichi, thank you so much for organizing the event. Thank you for the invitation. The report is available online in the website of the MENA Chief Economist Office. So on behalf of Roberta Gatti, the Chief Economist, Daniel Lederman, the Deputy Chief, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for connecting so early also for you in that side of the world.
Great, thank you very much. And also, we are going to post the presentation that was used by Nelly and Jessica this seminar on our website this morning in Japan time. So please take advantage of the presentation itself. With that, today we had the pleasure of having Jessica Torres and Nelly Elmarak, both the economists from the Office of the Middle East and North Africa region of the World Bank. Presented the latest edition of Middle East and North Africa Economic Update titled Balancing Act, Jobs and Wages in the Middle East and North Africa When Crisis Hit. So thank you very much for both of you. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Great. We are going to continue our journey through different regions this week. Tomorrow morning, we are going to introduce the latest edition of the Africa's Pulse, which is Africa region version of the Regional Economic Update. On Friday morning, we are going to feature the Europe and Central Asia Regional Economic Update. And also Tuesday next week, we will be featuring commodity market outlook, which was just released several days ago, last week actually. So please stay tuned and then see you tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.